Blockchain is, of course, evolving around the industry, and a lot of things that are happening are with companies that are starting to utilize it as a vehicle to maybe go public and also create a whole new ecosystem of revenue generating companies. Today, we're going to dive into that, and my name is Paul Barron. Welcome back to TechPath. Joining me today is, of course, a company by the name of BTCS. The CEO, Charles Allen, jumping in. Great to have you, Charles.
Paul, so thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Excellent. BTCS, for some of our viewers, listeners, maybe they're on the podcast, tell us a little about what BTCS, you guys have been around for a little bit, and also what you do, kind of how you play a role in the blockchain ecosystem.
Yeah, so just by way of history, we're actually the first U.S. public company focused on Bitcoin and blockchain technologies. We went public in 2014, just uplisted to the Nasdaq. About a week ago, which is, huge milestone for the company. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it only took 7 years, right? Some things are worth waiting for. We've been the first in a lot of respects. We were the first public company to mine Bitcoin, which, is now taken off to be one of, I think, 75-80% of public companies are focused on Bitcoin mining. We were the first public company to have a digital asset treasury strategy. Obviously, MicroStrategy is all over that now. And now we are, the first, again, doing something for the first time, first U.S. public company to focus on, disruptive proof of stake blockchains and are actively, running the nodes to secure those networks. And really what we look at is, blockchain technologies have the potential to be, the future of finance and beyond, right? And securing those underlying technologies and generating revenue by doing that is extremely compelling, right? That's basically the same model that Bitcoin miners are doing, except the difference is, Bitcoin's like a digital gold, and we are focused on, Ethereum, Cosmos, Avalanche, Tezos, and an array of blockchains that really have, huge potential in the future.
So we've had John Wu with Avalabs on a couple of times and really identified Avalanche as one of the early projects that we liked, and way early in the life cycle of where they were kind of evolving to well before many of their most recent news deals that they've been doing, and of course before DeFi, Avalanche Rush, all those kind of things. What made you go in and launch a node into the Avalanche ecosystem? What was the purpose of that? I mean, you could have went a million different ways. Why go there?
Well, look, we're monitoring the top, delegated proof of stake in similar type blockchains, right? Like just at a high level, Bitcoin's a amazing asset, but its technology is a little dated in comparison to some of the other things that are being developed, right? I know the Bitcoin maximalists will not love me saying that, but there's been so much development. We definitely prefer proof of stake and other, proof of history and these other derivatives of consensus algorithms, which have proven to be safe, secure, allow for faster transaction times. And really that's where the development is happening with respect to smart contracts. I mean, obviously Ethereum's kind of king of the hill, but there are other blockchains that are, compelling. And we kind of put Avalanche within that bucket. It was on our list going back to, the beginning of the year. I think in a presentation we put out in April, it was a, potential candidate. We subsequently, bought the token and then took the time to figure out how to get a node up and running in a, in kind of an enterprise, software, environment, right? So that's, we recently launched that. The timing was quite good. I mean, they'd raised what, 200, Avalanche raised what, 230 million.
Yep.
So that's obviously an impressive number, and our hope is that development will continue on on the blockchain. So our end goal is to really secure multiple disruptive blockchains as opposed to just doing one.
For sure. When you look at kind of the disruptive blockchains that are out there, I mean, we've seen everything from Polkadot, what Kusama is doing, obviously Avalanche. You've got the guys over at Algorand that are doing some pretty amazing things. And then, of course, the traditional strong arms of the industry, Ethereum, Cardano, et cetera. Is there any of these projects and blockchains that you think can stand the test of time? And when I say test of time, Bitcoin to a certain extent is definitely, as a store of value from a digital gold perspective, definitely in the right direction there. But when you look at kind of now blockchain moving into the next decade, there's a lot more use case scenarios that are going to playing into Web 3.0. Any of these that kind of stand out and you're saying these could be the plays that are going to be here decades to come?
Yeah, it's a great question. The reality is I don't have a crystal ball, and it's one of these things that when you look at, Bitcoin is not, I think, the premier technology, but it's a dominant player. I don't think it's going anywhere. And you have something that has a good technology, which is
Right.
really a good technology and an amazing proof of concept that now has institutional backing behind it. So I don't really see Bitcoin going anywhere. The question is, well, what are the other technologies and what can be built on those and what's going to survive? And that's a really hard question, right? I think Ethereum, based on the fact that it is, a very early blockchain, there's a huge amount of development in terms of, DeFi, NFT, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera. I mean, it's across the board. There's huge development in comparison to any other blockchain. But looking at others, right, like Solana has a very fast transaction time, right? Obviously, with these things, you have hiccups, right? Like there's been hiccups with
Right.
Cardano, there's been hiccups with Solana recently. So it's really hard to say in the long run, will one survive versus another? I mean, a great example, which kind of dates myself a little bit is, Betamax was a better technology, right? It was a smaller tape, and it didn't survive, right? VHS tapes survived, and though you could have a smaller thing instead of this big clunky, book-sized, tape to watch a movie, that's not what we ended up with for the better part of 10 years, right? Until it got displaced by DVDs, and now it's just streaming. So I think there's room for multiple blockchains. There's room for multiple technologies. There may be cases where you want a blockchain that's very high speed, right? And has, low latency like a Solana, or there may be times where, there are other projects getting built on top of that blockchain that you may want to integrate with, and it'd be easier for you to integrate with those other projects if you stay within the same ecosystem, right? Or you just
Right.
want to go kind of like the name brand. So, our view is, as opposed to, we're going after ones that we think are very compelling, um, but we don't have a crystal ball, right? The development could shift to a new blockchain if the community around that updates it and makes it faster or forks it, or it's still very, very early days and things are moving at a rapid pace. And our goal is to try to keep our thumb on the pulse, right?
Yeah, for
And
sure.
build for our own account ones that we find highly compelling, and then build, what we really want to build is like a staking as a service platform, or run the pools where others could delegate their crypto to our account, right? Or not really our
Interesting.
account, but to our pools, which is that
Yeah.
to me is, I think, the most interesting aspect of that we're working on.
Well, and I like the innovation. Obviously, the innovation, you're right, is at a pace right now where we could see some breakouts and or maybe some complete new projects that really come onto the scene and really kind of create new dynamics that no one's even thought of yet. When you get into the regulatory side of things, obviously we've seen the SEC push onto Ripple and what's happening there in the whole aspects around securities, but now you've got the SEC kind of looking at the whole yielding scenario that many companies play in, whether it's BlockFi, Celsius, Voyager, et cetera. What are your thoughts on regulatory movements, both from the SEC, and do you feel like this is a point that we're going to be dealing with for quite some time?
Well, I don't think regulation is going away. My kind of general view on regulation is, I think thoughtful regulation that allows for rapid innovation and prosperity within the U.S. is extremely important, right? Like no regulation can result in ICOs, pump and dumps, all sorts of things where just the general public is not protected. The
Sure.
question of how do you get to clear, concise, thoughtful regulation that promotes innovation within the country, and that's a really hard question. I mean, what I would love to see would be the Cryptocurrency Act of 2022, right? Come down from Congress, where it's thoughtful regulation with industry experts that come up with the right framework for companies to innovate with appropriate safe
Hmm.
harbors as they go through this process. Will that happen? I doubt it, right? I mean, there's kind of this fight of, is that in the SEC's bucket? Are we using the Howey test to figure out what a security is? Kind of pushing for guidance, and it's unclear. To your point of what BlockFi is doing in a Coinbase, that's a tricky one, right? I mean, if their product is, lending and borrowing, like I think at the end of the day, consumers should have some idea of what the counterparty risk is, right?
Yeah.
There's a way to do that that's not over-regulating. I think the approach of kind of regulation through enforcement is not one I really like. I would really like to see regulation through color and clarity provided to the industry so we can all make informed decisions on what we want to do. And it's something that having been at this for 7 years, we've had to we've been through the process, right? Like firsthand.
Yeah.
Like we were the first company to really get a registration statement through the SEC, and we had to numerous questions over a long period of time on, is Bitcoin or Ethereum, are they securities, right?
Sure.
And it gets really interesting, if you like thinking about this stuff is, you can have something that's a security, like Ethereum's ICO was, at least in our view, 100% a security at the time of the offering, right? I mean, it was, but it's not today, right? And so now you have these weird things where you offer something that's a security, and then maybe a year, 2 years later, or it could even be 6 months later, it's no longer a security. So like, what do you do with that, right? Like, how does that fit into the regulatory framework, and who gets to say when it is or is, when it is no longer a security, whether it was a security? And I think that's the biggest problem we have right now is just clarity. It is something, as we're extremely conservative with what we do. With just as a side note example, when we started staking Ethereum in Q1 this year and running validator nodes, we had accounting questions, right? That because we're the first US public company to do it, and that's why we didn't start in December when it was possible. That we actually decided to proactively go to the SEC's Office of Chief Accountants, prepare a memo. It's an expensive process to go through and basically say, hey, we need your guidance. It's unclear, right? If you read a current, accounting literature, no one's done this. It's unclear. We could go either way, right? We want your guidance so that, you don't come back later and say, hey, you got it wrong, right? But for a startup,
which has kind of been the case they've been on right now, even with Ripple, is that they are somewhat, or I should say litigating and trying to create regulation around the litigation side of it, as opposed to, because they're really not giving an answer to many of these companies, including Coinbase. I think recently with Brian Armstrong, their CEO, had asked the C's directly, how do we lend the right way? And then they finally just said, okay, this is not going to work if you're not going to cooperate at all with helping us understand what the clarity is. So I think you're right, to your point. Regulation going to happen. Do you think this is something, you had mentioned 2022, but you're really thinking this is more of a 23, maybe a 2024, or some major campaign starts to really go in this direction, and maybe utilizing it as a big stump approach, especially as the numbers go up here in the US with crypto enthusiasts and investors? So you think it's a 23 or 24 campaign run?
Look, I would love to see a crypto active 2022. It's not going to happen, right? Like, that's me being, thoughtful of, or optimistic of what I'd love to see. Give everyone color so they can go innovate and come up with something that addresses today's technology. That's not happening, right? Could it be 23, 24? I think the more people that get into crypto, and the more institutions that come in, and the more kind of noise that gets made, just as a country, as a people, right? The probability that something, goes through the legislative process that's, thoughtful, that addresses it, is more likely. It's funny just looking at like the number of friends I have that know nothing about crypto or have other careers, whether it's an airline pilot or a doctor, that are now being like, hey, you're in crypto. What do you think of this or that? I own some Ethereum in my Coinbase account, or I own some of this, or hey, should I buy DOT? Right?
Yeah.
Like that's something I didn't see when I got into this space in 2014. I told people I was into Bitcoin in 2013, 14. They're like, oh, what are you dealing drugs, right? Or you're what, paying for porn online? Now they're like, everybody and their brother's asking me about, other questions. So I think as you see the population, the general public, the average guy, have crypto as part of their portfolio, it becomes hard to shut the thing down, right? Because now you're hurting really society, right? And I don't think the end goal of the SEC is to try to, um, disrupt or hinder innovation. It's a question of like, how do you get it right? And that's a really, really
Yeah,
hard question. Like, how do you get it right in a thoughtful process? And the other thing you have to understand is like, the government's not necessarily the most efficient organization, right?
exactly.
Like the SEC has so many different departments, right? Like to assume it's like a well-oiled machine, it's a great assumption, but there are a lot of people that work there. It's a very big organization. They cover a lot of things outside of crypto. And this stuff is not easy to get your head around, right? It really
Yeah,
isn't, right? There's a
exactly.
learning curve, right? And I know they've been looking at it for a while, but it'd be nice to see. I'd love to see something in 2022. I think patience and education is going to be key in being um, tactful and smart as an industry as to how we try to influence the government and regulators, and to make sure that we do protect people, but we also allow for innovation and don't push things offshore, right? That there's
Yeah,
definitely,
for
because
sure.
it's going to be regulated, right? There's no, it's just a question
It's
of
going to happen.
who's
It's
going to
just a
do it.
matter of, can they do it the right way? Can we get, and, most likely they're going to come out with maybe a wrong aspect at first. And if they can, obviously adjust, tweak, adjust, and just continuously, as long as we have smart lawmakers, and we've had a couple of people on our own show, including Congressman Emmer, who is kind of really in that boat of understanding what's happening in crypto right now. The biggest concern I have is, your point, is pushing innovation offshore. That's the one concern I have, because that starts to put the U.S. at a disadvantage.
Oh, that's the biggest risk. At the end of the day, I look at blockchain technologies as like the future of finance and beyond, right?
Yep.
That's why we want to secure those, like the roots and the trunks of the trees that all this stuff is going to get built on top of, right? That's our business model, and that's kind of our belief. The question is, if we force the innovation, offshore and elsewhere, there's going to be huge developments and improvements, on a society, just for the world. And if we don't benefit from that, it's going to be really sad. In the
Yeah.
long run, it's there will be thoughtful regulation at some point. The question is, and the best way to think about this is, if you're 20 to 30 and you use crypto, you have it in your account, or maybe you go to your dad's investment advisor, and he's trying to put you in something where you're going to earn 0.5%, and you can go get stake your crypto and earn capital, either doing it yourself and holding your coins and doing it to a pool, or through a DeFi platform. Like as society grows up with this, they're going to demand, as they get older, right? When you get all
Yeah.
these people in their 20s and 30s, and their kids, at some point, like, Congress is going to be filled with people that grew up with this technology, right?
Yeah.
The question
Yeah.
is it going to take us 10, 20, 30 years to get it right, or are we going to figure it out and be a leader in the space, right? Or are we going to be behind? And that's
Yeah.
my big one.
I can only think if we had done this with the internet, if we had not embraced the internet the way that we did, being the United States, it could have landed in the hands of China or Russia, and it would have been a different world, in essence. And really, that's what we're dealing with, especially around blockchain. The innovation is absolutely mind-blowing, and the abilities that it's going to have and be able to do, it's much like what we saw in the early days of the internet, and really what we thought was going to happen has actually happened. And we've seen unbelievable expansion in terms of economic. Businesses now are completely run on it. Could you imagine how we would have dealt with this recent issue we had from the health side if the internet had not been really as mature as it is today? So big thing there. A couple of questions I want to run at you, and that is the cycles. You've been around since really the early days of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. What are your thoughts on these cycles, the 4-year cycles, the halving, and the massive market corrections that we see? Do you feel like that's still intact going forward, or do you feel like those have kind of waned a little?
I think they're going to wane a little bit, primarily, look, Bitcoin's still small, as like the number one,
Right.
cryptocurrency. It's still small in comparison to other markets, right? It's huge, but I think as it's gotten larger, volatility in Bitcoin is much lower than volatility in the alts, right? And especially as you get into like some of these like
Sure.
really small ones, right? It's almost like companies, right? Like,
Exactly.
you,
Yep.
you don't see Microsoft like doubling overnight, but you could look and be like, whoa, I woke up and Tesla's was up 500% or 100% or whatever it is, right? That's possible. So just like, like a small cap company. A small cap company is much more has a lot more volatility, right? The
Yeah.
probability a company can go from 100 million to a 200 million market cap is much more probable than a company going from 100 billion to 200 billion. So I think, with Bitcoin, there's so much institutional interest. Um, I don't see the same. It's still highly volatile compared to other assets, but I think over time, I think the cycles will be dampened by just the sheer size as it gets bigger and the number of players, right?
Yeah.
As well as the development of like an options market, futures market, et cetera, right? All those derivative functionalities around a market can add to stability in the market, right? Things that add uncertainty, which add to volatility, are like, okay, is there disclosure behind it, right? I mean, that's one of the
Yeah.
SEC's issues is there market manipulation in Bitcoin? We won't do an ETF because they're worried about that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's less
Yeah.
of an issue with Bitcoin, but
So a little bit more softened. We may not see the necessarily 80% fall off in this bull run. Do you feel like this bull run's still intact?
I think so. I mean, we've had a pullback. Um, I think there's a lot of people still sitting on the sidelines of institutions I
Interesting.
talk to. There's a lot of discussions about, how do you add this as a product, right? And I think Bitcoin, a lot of people have figured it out. But issues like custody, counterparty risk.
Right.
If you're an institution, you report to your shareholders, right? You've got most likely a board, shareholders, operating agreements. If you're an investment company, you have all these things that you need to think about before you can kind of dabble. I think that process takes a lot of time, especially for banks looking at it. And so, most of them are focused on Bitcoin, right? And then
Yeah.
secondarily, Ethereum. Our focus is kind of, let's look at where the tech is, because that's
Sure.
that's what I think is going to drive true value. And Bitcoin's a great store of value, but I think it's just gonna take time before volatility comes out of the market.
Yeah, I think you guys are onto something in the sense of really kind of looking at the real potential innovators in the tech side and going after, whether it's node expansion or dealing it, especially around the proof of stake projects that are out there. I like the approach that BTCS is using. A couple of last questions for you here, though, and that is Kathy Wood, recent conference, basically put a price tag on Bitcoin at 500K by 2026. How aggressive do you think that is?
I think it's pretty aggressive, right? But again, I wouldn't, and I don't want to put a price target out there. I kind of hate doing that because either you look like a genius and like no one has a crystal ball, so it's
Right.
you're just kind of guessing and throwing darts, and you can do a lot of fancy analysis about money on the sidelines and where it may go. I'd love to see that. That'd be great. I think it'd be great for the industry.
Sure.
That's a big jump from where we are today, and it's in a Bitcoin's had a great run every year. I mean, every year over year, it's up, right? There's even despite the pullbacks. I mean, we've lived through a couple cycles. I mean, I remember it dropping from $1,300 to $130 for Bitcoin, and this back in like I think 14, 15. Everyone told me like it's over. Pack your
Right.
bags, go do something different with your life.
Yeah.
And we've seen it obviously. Go back up, and even looking at like I remember 3,000 was like, wow, that's so expensive. How am I buying Bitcoin for like $2,000-3,000? That's crazy,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
so I wouldn't be shocked if it hits that $500,000 mark, but I do think it's a bit on the aggressive
On the
mark,
aggressive side.
considering yeah, just considering how much how big it is now, right?
Yeah.
It's just so much easier. Like if you said, hey, I think Ethereum's going to double or triple, like okay, I can get my head around it a little bit more easily, or any of the smaller, kind of multi-billion-dollar tokens, and I knew from the 2 to 5 range, being like, hey, those are gonna go up tenfold. Like, okay, or fivefold. That's a much easier. You don't need as much demand to move it, right? I
Well,
think
that would
Bitcoin.
push it to the range of around a 10 to 15 trillion dollar market. So
Yeah.
now you're getting into real financial, investment class that is global at that point. So for sure. Do you think ETFs will roll out this year, or do you think it's going to take another year for that?
Given the signals that the SEC has been kind of putting out, we'll see. I mean, I remember when we went public in 2014, the first attempt at an ETF was the Winklevoss brothers had one.
Yep.
I don't know if anyone really recalls that, and it was actually really helpful to us because they did a great job. I mean, I'm guessing they probably spent $1 million on legal, coming up with good language around how the blockchain works and et cetera. Now most companies don't have that detail, but this is 7 years later and we don't have one. I'm not, I'm not optimistic because I still think the question of is there market manipulation hasn't been answered, right?
Yeah.
And until that's answered to a satisfactory degree, I just, I'm not convinced. It's great to see people keep applying. Grayscale is a great example in that they've kind of taken a different approach, right?
Sure.
They're not trying to
Yep.
do an ETF. They do these private placements under Rule 144, let it age, and
Right.
then poof, you've got a trading product on the OTCQX, right? So I'm not. I'd love to see it happen. I think it would bring great credibility to the industry. I don't think. I'm not optimistic that I see that coming. I don't even know who's pushing it. There's always a new firm. Every year there's two or three that push and think they're going to be. There was the Winklevoss brothers and SolidX and Dan. I mean, it was just like everybody and their brother tries. At some point, someone will be the one
Someone's
that
going to hit it.
Someone's going to hit it, right? And it's like, who's going to spend the money and who's going to get the timing right when the SEC gets to the point where like, okay, we're comfortable with some of the issues I discussed. So I wouldn't expect it this year, right? We're getting to the end of the year, and I don't even know if I'd expect it next year. So we'll see.
Last question, Charles, and that is, you've seen the space, you kind of understand kind of where this is forecasting out. Biggest challenge right now for crypto in general? Still regulatory, or do you feel like it might be adoption?
I think those are both very big challenges, right? On the regulatory side, there's not a lot of clarity. There's been a lot of adoption over the last couple of years, and I really see that adoption in like DeFi and NFTs, right? I mean, we talked about all sorts of ways crypto would get adopted, 4 or 5 years ago. It would be securities on the blockchain, and Overstock with their T0 platform kind of pushed that. Real estate records. I mean, I've seen everybody and their brother has a good idea. The ones that have kind of stuck is NFTs and DeFi, and I think those. I mean, actually, I love the idea of NFTs, especially for like concert tickets and things like that, where you have a one-time use asset that could be traded in the market for like a sporting event or something. I think it's like this is the best solution ever. Like you don't need Ticketmaster, you don't need StubHub. Like you get rid of all that stuff, right? Allowing it for individuals to do things as well, right? So I think regulation. I mean, you nailed it. It's regulation and adoption. Adoption is going to come with education, and most importantly, for people to use blockchain technologies, they have to not know they're using them, right? Think about the internet, and I lived through this. I worked at a tech company in '99. People were talking about FTP and HTTPS, and I was in the fiber optic space, and you know what? People don't care about that. They don't want to know how it works. They just want cool products, right?
Yeah.
They want to, now you want to just use your Uber. You don't care how it works. You got a GPS in your phone, your taxi, your Uber shows up. You don't, you want to order something on Amazon and you want it to show up. You want to, whatever you want to do, you just want it to work. You don't want to think about why or how it works or have to understand the technology. You just want a value add, product or, service that you're going to use and enjoy using that's going to make, your day-to-day life better, right? And so when that happens, where you don't have to think about the rails or the technology behind it, that's when you'll have like adoption can take off, right? And NFTs are kind of there in that, people are using them, but it's still, I mean, if you look at these platforms, it's not for like
It's early days, yeah. It's very
early days. I mean, the platforms you're not going to Amazon, right? Like you get on these platforms, it's not like, swipe left, swipe right, 2 clicks, I'm out of here. I got something, I get it. I'm going to take that NFT and throw it up on my digital picture frame and things are all integrated. Like it's early days. Yeah. It's just not there yet.
It is for the technically advanced, I think, when you look at NFTs and in general NFT gaming, even to a certain extent, even though the gamer community is much more, I think prepared for this kind of shift, and they're probably just 1 or 2 steps away from that really becoming a mainstream aspect. Gaming may be the real pure play that really evolves out of what we see in terms of NFTs. So it's going to be fun to watch.
Yep.
Charles Allen, great to have you on. Hey, congrats on your listing there on the stock exchange. Great to have you guys on. It's going to be good and fun to watch you for sure. So good luck with what you guys are doing.
Yeah, Paul, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Excellent. All right, you guys are listening in over on the podcast right now. Make sure and subscribe. That's the best way to, of course, get the audio version of TechPath and here on the Paul Barron Network. But if you're looking for charts and some of these great CEO interviews, the best place is right here on YouTube, where you can, of course, subscribe and hit the bell for more notifications of content just like this. If you want to reach out to me direct, just hit me up on Twitter @Paul Barron. We'll catch you next time right here on TechPath.